This might be one of the most hyped gaming mouse release of the year. It's the Pulsar Xlite V3 and the Xlite V3 ES, denoted from the metal scroll wheel and the little red stripe here. It cost $100 and $130 respectively, and well, there's a lot of hype around them, seeing that they are much awaited updates to Pulsar's extremely popular Xlite V2 lineup. So the question is, are they worth it? Are they competitive with some of the gaming mice that have been released recently, like the rather impressive Lamzu Thorn? Let's start with the shape. Now, a lot of people on Reddit, when I first posted pictures, said that this kind of looked like a Death Feather V3 Pro. And some people were saying that dimensions-wise, it's very similar. The truth is though, it's far from the Death Feather V3 Pro. I think that's more likely going to be the case for the bigger Xlite V3 size 3. This is the size 2 medium, and actually it's more like the Zowie EC3 CW and the Lamzu Thorn in terms of how big it feels in the hand and well, how big it is overall. When you put it side by side with the Zowie EC3 CW, their similarities are extremely apparent. You've got deep finger grooves, you've got a deep groove on the left for your thumb to rest, you've got a ergonomic shape that has a nice hump in the middle, as well as a slight tilt towards the right so that your arm is at a more natural angle. You also have a slope that comes out on the right side to support your fourth finger and your pinky as a traditional ergonomic mouse shape would, and all in all, it does remind me heavily of the EC3 CW that it has a similar size to. However, in terms of actual sizing and how big it feels in the hand, I wouldn't say that it is the same size as the EC3, and I also wouldn't say that it's the same size as the Lamzu Thorn it's also clearly competing with. I would say it's actually surprisingly in between. It actually has very similar dimensions to the Lamzu Thorn, which I always thought was ever so slightly bigger than the EC3. However, because of its deeper finger grooves, it actually feels smaller in the hand than the Lamzu Thorn despite being the same dimensions. The Thorn has a slightly less tilt to the right, and that the middle hump on the Thorn has a kind of greater peak. Like the hump is bigger, it's not only taller, but also has more volume. So it actually protrudes and pokes into the front of your palm a little bit more. Now this gives more palm support, especially if you like having your arm arched up a little bit. However, it is a subjective thing, and some people might prefer the lower, more gentle hump on the Xlite V3. Also, the Lamzu Thorn has rounder edges and a overall puffier shape that kind of puffs out a little bit since it doesn't have deep grooves. It also feels bigger because of that. In terms of size and grip recommendations, I mean, for my 19.5cm long hands, this mouse is darn near perfect for the kind of claw grip which I do, which is more of a relaxed claw grip. If you're trying to do a palm grip, my hands can kind of barely make it, though it is still a little bit too big to be that comfortable for a palm grip. In terms of generalized size recommendations though, approximately I would say that for small size hands up to about 18.5cm long, you should be able to palm grip this mouse reasonably comfortably. If you're trying to claw grip this mouse, I can see it working for a lot of hands anywhere from 17.5cm long to about 22cm long. So on the higher end of that, you should be expecting to do a very aggressive claw grip with a lot of finger arching, which might not be desirable. So if you're doing a fingertip grip, even my 19.5cm long hands with stubby fingers can fingertip grip this mouse, no problem, because the clicks extend quite far back and they're pretty consistent throughout. So I probably would say that anybody with hands longer than 19cm should be able to fingertip grip the size 2 Xlite V3 shapes, no problem. And if you're wondering if there's any shape differences between the Xlite V3 and the V3 ES, the answer is, as far as I can tell, absolutely not. Same angle, same hump, same size and everything. It feels basically identical in terms of the shape. Anyway, so let's talk about the other aspects of the Xlite V3 and the V3 ES. The clicks use the same optical switches that you find on the X2 V2 and X2H. However, all the stiff clicks complaints I had about the X2 V2 and the X2H have been completely fixed. And I'm glad to report that the double step click issue that some people have noticed on the X2 is not present at all here on the Xlite V3 whatsoever. The clicks are a lot lighter, a lot crisper, a lot snappier, and they feel almost as good, if not as good, as the Death Feather V3 Pro it claims to use the same switches as. And I think that is a very good achievement. However, it seems like there is a bit of pre-travel and a little bit of post-travel on both of the Xlite V3s, which actually might be the reason why the clicks are lighter. Because if you look at the X2 and the X2 V2, they have basically zero post-travel and zero pre-travel, but the clicks are really stiff. And since they're using the same switches, I'm guessing this is the reason why the clicks feel stiff. It's kind of like a trade-off thing. If you keep the switches consistent and you want the switches to be lighter, you kind of have to make it looser. But when you make the clicks looser, you generally introduce a bit more play that allows for a bit more pre or post-travel. That's not to say it's bad clicks all of a sudden, it's just just not as secure and in place as on the X2. However, I am more than willing to take this trade-off if it means the clicks are more reasonably weighted and lighter, and it is definitely here. However, there is one difference between the Xlite V3 and the V3 ES. The ES feels a little bit stiffer click-wise. Now, I don't know whether this is a QC thing or whether it is an intentional thing, but the V3 ES also has slightly less pre and post travel. Funny, because it seems to prove my hypothesis that the stiffer a click, the lesser the pre and post travel. That seems to be holding true here. There are more differences though between the Xlite V3 and the V3 ES, and that is notable when we move to the scroll wheel. The Xlite V3 has one of the best scroll wheels I've actually ever used. It uses Pulsar's blue encoder, which is the same as the Pulsar X2. But the scroll wheel itself is actually a little bit bigger than on the X2, but it just feels amazing. It's notchy, it's snappy, it's crisp, it's direct. It's easy to flick fast. It's also very easy to get precise scrolls and steps in, which I really appreciate. This is easily my favorite scroll wheel in a very long time. However, on the Xlite V3 ES, you have the same encoder, but a big, chunky aluminum scroll wheel. This scroll wheel is taller, it's wider, which might be a good or bad thing depending on who you ask. I like that it's cold to the touch, but I also don't like that it's a little bit lighter. It's a lot easier to bunny hop with this, I would say, because it's lighter, so you can just flick a lot more easily. However, the lightness also means that it's a little bit more difficult to make precise individual steps. It's not so light that it's a deal breaker and impossible to use. I'm just saying that it feels different in that way. Another key difference between the Xlite V3 and the V3 ES is the coating. Now, the Xlite V3 has a reasonably good coating. It's basically the same as what you get on the Pulsar X2. However, because it's a ergonomic mouse that you have a lot of contact points with, if you're not fingertip gripping, you actually find that the coating is plentiful. Whereas on the X2, I found it a little bit slippery at times. The Xlite V3's coating feels perfectly adequate to me. But the ES takes it up another notch and it feels a whole lot better. As you can see, it's slightly darker in color because it's slightly glossier, and that actually ends up with a slightly grippier feeling mouse. However, if you do have a lot of palm sweat and a lot of finger moisture often, then it actually is going to end up being more slippery, in my personal experience, than the Xlite V3. The coating is not quite to the level of Zowie, Vexi, or even the Endgame Gear OP1 yet, but it is a nice improvement over the normal Xlite V3 and the other Pulsar mice. As for the thumb buttons, well, they're very similar to the Zowie in terms of their shape, but they definitely don't have as much spongy post-travel as the Zowie, which is a good thing. They kind of have a crisp, light click, and they do have quite a bit of travel, so you have a very satisfying tactile press down. Now, let's go to the bottom where things get interesting. So we have the familiar 3395 sensor and the Nordic MCU here that you find on the X2V2 and the X2H. And in terms of click latency and wireless performance, I've tested it. It's basically identical to the X2V2 and the X2H, aka within margin of error. So nothing to really worry about here. But just for your information, the Xlite V3 does support 4000Hz polling rate. Because of that Nordic MCU it shares with the Pulsar X2. Now, this 4000Hz polling rate dongle isn't actually widely advertised. I'm guessing it's because they want to use it as a more differentiating factor for the Xlite V3 ES, but it does come with support for 4000Hz polling rate wirelessly if you get the optional $20 dongle. That actually significantly closes the price difference between the $130 Xlite V3 ES and the Xlite V3, but we'll talk about the value proposition in a bit. Let's talk about the special things on the bottom of the mouse that the ES has, and the really interesting key feature here that got a lot of people interested and also laughing at the mouse because they think, hey, this is pointless, is the screen. So on the bottom of the Xlite V3 ES, you get a nice little OLED display. And Pulsar actually say that this adds really little weight to the overall mouse, and it also actually really doesn't hurt battery life because, well, it's going to be off most of the time. As for people who are saying that this is a utterly pointless thing to have, I would strongly disagree, because the Xlite V3 ES having this little screen means that you can change everything on the mouse itself without installing software. You can change DPI, polling rate, lift off distance, turn off motion sync, you can change your debounce delay even on the screen itself. And if you are making an esports tournament edition mouse that someone's going to bring out to an esports tournament, then them not having to rely on mouse software that might not be able to be installed on a esports tournament computer is actually a really interesting feature that makes a lot of sense. Also, a lot of people just hate having mouse software or unnecessary software running on their computer, so having it all controlled on the MCU of the mouse itself is really cool. I also hope someone can hack the MCU of this so that you can actually play Doom on the mouse itself, but it will be a while before that happens, so let's see. This also has 8000Hz polling rate when you run it in wired mode. Now, 8000 Hz polling rate seems like a lot, but frankly, it's not going to make a massive impact to a lot of people's lives, not as much as not having a wire would do. So I wouldn't run it in wired mode just for 8K Hz polling rate unless you are just obsessed with numbers, because not having a wire makes life so much better that it significantly outweighs having 8000 Hz polling rate versus 4000 Hz polling rate. Also, there are no holes on the bottom of the Xlite V3 ES, which is helpful for a mouse that you might bring to an esports tournament because you don't want dirt or water to get in there and the mouse to fail. And also, the Xlite V3 ES comes with a 4000 Hz polling rate straight out of the box, so it's not an optional extra that you have to pay for. You can run it in 1000 Hz still if you want to save battery life, but 4000 Hz. Speaking of battery life, the Xlite V3 ES has a much bigger battery than the Xlite V3. And this is actually where most of the weight difference comes from. So I didn't mention this at the start, but the Xlite V3 ES is 65 grams, Xlite V3 is 55 grams. And before you ask, yes, you can feel the difference. It's quite significant. It's like 20% weight difference. This bigger weight is not really from the OLED screen or the holes at the bottom. Those add like 2-3 grams according to Pulsar themselves. It really comes from the bigger battery. And now Pulsar rates the Xlite V3 for 110 hours of use at 1000 Hz, which I am not too sure about since it has a smaller battery. And they also rate the Xlite V3 ES at 4000 Hz polling rate to have 70 to 100 hours of usage. But the Xlite V3 and V3 ES definitely have good battery life when you run it at 1000 Hz and 4000 Hz respectively. I've used it pretty much incessantly as my office mouse at 4000 Hz just to see how long it would last. I run at 3200 DPI, so it's basically consistently running at that high polling rate, and I still haven't had to charge it yet. And I basically used it on and off about 8 hours a day on average over the last 4 days. And right now the battery life is at about 50 something percent. So it seems like their battery quotation might be rather accurate. Now this additional 10 grams, as I said, is noticeable, but both mice are still very well balanced. The battery of the Xlite V3 ES actually is in the rear of the mouse, which might feel a little bit weird because to some it might feel rear heavy, but if you look at it, the balance of the mouse actually ends up being pretty centered with good center of gravity. However, there is a difference between something that has the center of gravity in the middle and most of its weight in the middle versus something that has a center of gravity in the middle but most of the weight on the extreme ends. Basically, just imagine you're holding a stick that weighs 10 kg, but it's really short and you're just holding the middle, versus holding a really long stick that has a center of gravity of 10 kg in the middle, but most of the weight is on the extreme ends in buckets of water. The weights being on the extreme ends, in this case with the metal scroll wheel and the battery being in the back, is going to make the mouse feel a little bit harder to rotate quickly, but it's mostly from the fact that it's 10 grams more rather than the weight placement of it. The balance is still plenty good. So, in conclusion then, the Pulsar Xlite V3 and the Xlite V3 ES, do they perform well? Are they good gaming mice? The answer is absolutely yes. Are they better than the competition? When you put the V3 side by side with the Lamzu Thorn, it becomes apparent that the competition is just fierce and neck. Both are really lightweight, both perform really well, both have really solid clicks and solid scroll wheels and solid thumb buttons. The main difference here is the shape. If you like puffier shapes, as I said, go with the Thorn. If you like deeper grooves on your shapes, go with the Pulsar Xlite V3. Also, another key difference is that the V3 is reliant on its reasonably okay coating, and the Lamzu Thorn does come with grip tape. Then the next question comes down to, hey, I like the Xlite V3 shape more, but should I get the V3 ES or the V3? And this is actually very interesting. So the V3 ES comes in at 65 grams, which is heavy to many because, you know, the Xlite V3 is 55 grams and $30 cheaper. So the Xlite V3 ES has a lot of things going for it for that extra $30 that you pay over the Xlite V3. Yes, you lose out having a slightly heavier mouse, but you get a lot more battery life. You get a 4000 Hz polling rate dongle that will cost you $20 to get if you just got the normal Xlite. You also get a aluminum scroll wheel that feels really unique. It doesn't particularly improve performance, but it feels cool. You get slightly better coating, you get a whole OLED screen on the bottom, and all that is for $10 difference between this and the Xlite V3, assuming you get the 4000 Hz polling rate dongle. So as a consumer, I really think this decision boils down not to whether one has more value than the other. I think it really boils down to whether you care or you want those features that the Xlite V3 ES has. The screen, the scroll wheel, the coating, and the battery life. So if you don't care about 4K Hz, Xlite V3. If you want 4K Hz, but you are not okay with the 10 grams difference, at the Xlite V3 with the 4000 Hz polling rate dongle. If you are okay with the 10 grams and you do like the additional features that the ES has, then pay the extra 30 bucks and get the Xlite V3 ES instead is my recommendation. Either way, Pulsar has a very good gaming mouse here on their hands. The Xlite V3 is a solid release. Hopefully it doesn't have QC issues that are significantly bad. And with that, thank you guys so much for watching. This is a really long video because I want to make sure I covered every single thing. Like and subscribe. Bye.
One dead. Nice. Wait, watch the glow.
My bad, boys. 104, 104.
Someone watch flank. We just play slow, we have time. Nice. One down. One.